It happened in a room where nothing is ever said by accident. When Prince Edward finally spoke, the silence that followed was louder than any royal decree. Across the table, Queen Camilla froze, caught off guard in a way few had ever witnessed. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an unraveling. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind those closed doors, according to whispers that would later ripple through palace corridors, was not a sudden explosion but the release of tension that had been building for weeks, perhaps even months. The meeting itself had been scheduled under routine pretenses, a quiet gathering of senior aides and trusted figures meant to address internal concerns that, on the surface, appeared procedural. But insiders would later suggest that the atmosphere felt different from the very beginning, thick, cautious, almost anticipatory, as though everyone present understood that something unspoken was waiting to surface. Prince Edward, long known as the monarchy's quiet sentinel, had built a reputation on restraint. For decades, he had remained firmly in the background, navigating the intricate machinery of royal duty with precision and silence. He was not prone to emotional displays, nor was he known for confrontation, which is precisely why the shift, when it came, felt so jarring. Reports suggest that as discussions moved from routine matters to more sensitive territory, Edward's demeanor began to change subtly at first, a tightening of tone, a pause held just a fraction too long. Those familiar with such meetings would later note that this was the first signal that something deeper was unfolding, something that could no longer be managed through quiet diplomacy. Across the table, Queen Camilla had reportedly entered the meeting with her usual composure, confident and measured, accustomed to navigating the delicate balance of influence, perception that defined her role. Yet even she could not have anticipated what would follow. As Edward spoke calmly, deliberately, his words carried a weight that immediately altered the dynamic of the room. It wasn't an accusation in the traditional sense, not a direct challenge, but something far more unsettling. An admission layered with implication, suggesting that decisions had been made, lines had been crossed, and consequences were now unavoidable. Various interpretations of that moment describe a visible shift in Camilla's expression, a rare flicker of uncertainty that those present would not soon forget. The reaction among the aides was immediate, though carefully controlled. Palace protocol demanded composure, but insiders whisper that the atmosphere fractured almost instantly. Notes were no longer taken with the same steady rhythm, glances were exchanged with quiet urgency, and the usual cadence of discussion dissolved into something far more fragile. It was as if the machinery of the institution had briefly stalled, caught between maintaining order and confronting the reality of what had just been set in motion. Within hours, efforts would begin to contain the narrative, to ensure that whatever had transpired remained confined to that room. But containment, as history often proves, is rarely absolute. What made the moment so chilling was not just what was said, but what it implied. For weeks, there had been murmurs, subtle, fragmented, easily dismissed. Media insiders had hinted that something within the royal household felt off, though no one could quite define it. Now, those fragments were beginning to align, forming a clearer, more troubling picture. The admission, though carefully phrased, had confirmed what many had only suspected, that beneath the polished surface of unity, deeper fractures were beginning to show. And as those whispers began to circulate beyond the palace walls, the question was no longer whether something had happened, how far its consequences would reach. But Edward's words weren't spontaneous, they were the culmination of something far more calculated. For decades, Prince Edward had remained the monarchy's quiet constant, never loud, never reckless. Which is precisely why his sudden shift sent shockwaves through the institution. To understand the weight of that moment, one has to understand the man himself, a figure often overlooked precisely because he never demanded attention. While others commanded headlines, Edward operated in the margins, where the real machinery of the crown quietly turns. Reports suggest he became known among palace circles as the guardian of the fine print, the one who noticed what others missed, the one who read beyond the surface, who understood that in the monarchy, the smallest clause could carry the greatest consequence. It was a role built not on charisma, but on precision, years of observing, documenting, and preserving the delicate balance that held everything together. That reputation did not form overnight. Those familiar with the inner workings of the royal household often point to Edward's decades of disciplined restraint, a steady presence during moments when the institution faced both public scrutiny and private strain. He was the one who rarely reacted, rarely raised his voice, and never stepped out of line. Which is why, when insiders began to whisper that something had shifted in his approach, those whispers carried an unusual weight. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation in routine approvals, a request for clarification where none had been asked before. Small, almost invisible signals that suggested he was no longer simply observing but evaluating. And behind those signals, pressure had been building. Various interpretations of recent palace activity describe an environment that had grown increasingly tense, though never openly acknowledged. Decisions were being made, some routine, others less so, and not all of them sat comfortably within the traditional frameworks that had governed the monarchy for generations. Insiders whisper that Edward had grown increasingly concerned about the direction of those decisions, particularly those that seemed to blur the lines between influence and authority. It wasn't a single event that triggered his shift, but rather a pattern quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Those closest to the situation suggest that Edward had begun weeks earlier to take a more active interest in internal matters that he would typically leave to others. Documents were reviewed more carefully. Meetings were attended with greater scrutiny. Questions were asked not confrontational, but deliberate, precise, and difficult to dismiss. It was as though he had been preparing, gathering threads of information that, on their own, meant little, but together formed something far more significant. A picture was emerging, one that pointed to a deeper issue within the structure of the institution itself, and then there was the tone. Those who had worked alongside him for years began to notice at first the shift in how he spoke, how he framed his thoughts. Still calm, still measured, but no longer distant. There was an edge now, a quiet urgency that hadn't been there before. Palace administrative streams, ranging from staff briefings to informal conversations, began to reflect this change. It was not dramatic, not overt, but it was unmistakable. Something had moved Edward from silent observer to reluctant participant, and whatever it was, it carried enough weight to break decades of carefully maintained restraint. By the time that closed-door meeting took place, the shift was already complete. The man who entered that room was not just the quiet sentinel the monarchy had always relied on, but someone who had reached a threshold, someone who had seen enough, understood enough, and decided that silence was no longer an option. And as his words began to reshape the fragile balance, within those walls it became clear that this was not a reaction born of impulse, but the result of something far more deliberate, something that had been building beneath the surface long before anyone realized its significance. And at the center of his concern was a decision that many believed should never have been made. It wasn't announced. It wasn't documented publicly. But according to palace insiders, a quiet move had already set everything in motion, and it had Queen Camilla at its center. What made it so unsettling was not its scale, but its silence. Reports suggest that the decision, never formally disclosed, never openly debated, began as a subtle shift in internal authority, one that blurred the long-standing boundaries between ceremonial influence and operational control. Those familiar with palace structures describe it as the kind of change that, on paper, might appear routine, almost administrative. But within the rigid architecture of the monarchy, even the smallest adjustment can carry profound consequences, especially when it touches the delicate balance of power that has been preserved for generations. Insiders whisper that this quiet move was tied to a combination of influence, access, and appointments areas that traditionally follow strict, almost sacred protocols. Yet, according to various interpretations, those protocols may have been bent, if not entirely bypassed. Queen Camilla, whose role had steadily evolved in recent years, was increasingly seen as a central figure in what some have described as domestic diplomacy, a network of decisions and relationships that shaped the monarchy from within. It was not an official title, nor a formally recognized position, but it carried weight. And with that weight came influence, the kind that operates quietly, away from public scrutiny, but leaves a lasting imprint on the institution itself. But influence, when left unchecked, can begin to shift the ground beneath it. Palace administrative streams, ranging from internal briefings to informal exchanges, began to reflect growing unease. There were murmurs of decisions being made outside traditional channels, of roles being adjusted without the usual layers of consultation, of authority being exercised in ways that felt unfamiliar, even to those who had spent decades within the system. None of it was overt, none of it openly challenged, at least not at first. But the pattern was there, and for those paying close attention, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Among those paying attention was Prince Edward. For someone who had built his entire role around understanding the fine details, the subtle shifts, this was not just another internal adjustment, it was a signal. Reports suggest that Edward began to piece together the implications, tracing the threads of decisions that, when viewed individually, seemed harmless, but together pointed to something far more significant. The concern was not about a single action, but about the precedent it set. If protocols could be adjusted quietly once, what would prevent them from being adjusted again? And it was here that the tension deepened. Early resistance, though carefully contained, began to emerge from within the senior ranks. Not open defiance, not confrontation, but hesitation. Questions raised in private. Clarifications requested with unusual persistence. Those familiar with the situation describe a growing sense that something was being tested, limits, boundaries, perhaps even the resilience of the institution itself. Yet no one moved decisively, no one stepped forward to challenge it outright. The silence once again held. For Edward, that silence became its own form of pressure. The more he examined the situation, the clearer it became that what was unfolding could not remain unaddressed. Insiders suggest that his concern was not rooted in personal disagreement, but in a deeper fear that the integrity of the system itself was being gradually, almost imperceptibly reshaped. And once such changes take hold, they are rarely easy to reverse. As the pieces fell into place, the quiet move that had once seemed insignificant began to reveal its true weight. It was no longer just an internal adjustment. It was a turning point, one that would force those within the palace to confront a question they had long avoided. Where does influence end, and where must duty take its stand? What Edward revealed next would turn private concern into undeniable confrontation. When the admission finally came, it wasn't framed as an accusation, but it landed like one. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. Prince Edward did not raise his voice, did not abandon the restraint that had defined him for decades. Instead, he spoke with a precision that made every word feel deliberate, measured, and impossible to dismiss. Reports suggest that what he revealed was not a single discovery, but a carefully assembled understanding, threads of information drawn together into something far more difficult to ignore. He outlined patterns, not incidents, sequences, not isolated moments. And in doing so, he transformed what had once been whispers into something that carried the weight of undeniable implication. Those familiar with the dynamics of such meetings describe the way his language unfolded, controlled, almost clinical, yet charged with an undercurrent of urgency. He did not accuse Queen Camilla directly. Instead, he referenced decisions, processes, and outcomes, each one placed with careful intent, each one building toward a conclusion that did not need to be explicitly stated. It was this restraint that made the moment so powerful. Because in the absence of direct accusation, there was no easy defense, no immediate rebuttal, only silence and the growing realization of what those words suggested. Across the table, Queen Camilla's reaction, according to various interpretations, was unlike anything those present had seen before. For someone so accustomed to navigating scrutiny, to maintaining composure under pressure, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. A pause held too long. A response that never fully formed. Insiders whisper that disbelief flickered, first an attempt to process what was being implied, followed by something deeper, something closer to recognition. It was not just the content of Edward's admission that unsettled the room, but the fact that it had been said at all. The others present were caught in the same moment of suspended certainty. Palace aides, trained to maintain neutrality, found themselves navigating an atmosphere that had changed in an instant. The usual rhythm of discussion, structured, predictable, had dissolved. In its place was something far more fragile, a tension that could not be easily contained or redirected. Glances were exchanged, not openly, but with enough frequency to signal that everyone understood the significance of what was unfolding. This was no longer a routine internal discussion. It had crossed into something far more consequential. And at the center of it all was the gravity of what had been implied. Because Edward's words did not just question a decision, they challenged the process behind it, the authority that had allowed it, and the precedent it might set. Reports suggest that in that moment, the room collectively understood that this was not an issue that could be quietly resolved or filed away. It had touched something fundamental within the structure of the monarchy itself, something that demanded attention, clarity, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, accountability. What made the moment even more volatile was the immediate realization that it could not remain contained. Palace administrative streams are designed to manage information, to control narratives, to ensure that internal matters do not spill beyond carefully guarded boundaries. But insiders suggest that the nature of this admission made containment nearly impossible. Too many people had heard it, too many understood its implications. And once such a realization takes hold, it begins to move quietly at first, then with increasing momentum. The silence that followed Edward's words was not empty. It was charged, heavy with the knowledge that something irreversible had just occurred. Because once a truth, or even the suggestion of one, is spoken within those walls, it does not simply disappear. It lingers, it spreads, and it forces a response. And as that realization began to settle over everyone present, one thing became clear. Whatever had started in that room was no longer confined to it. But the fallout didn't end in that room, it had only just begun. Within hours, the palace machinery shifted into overdrive. Phones rang, doors closed, and a single question echoed through the corridors. How far would this go? What had begun as a contained exchange now moved with unsettling Arabexine Arabekrat, Arabectine Arabecta through the inner workings of the institution, triggering a response that insiders describe as both immediate and deeply calculated. Senior aides, long trained to handle crises with precision, were suddenly pulled into a series of emergency consultations, each one more urgent than the last. Reports suggest that these meetings were not about understanding what had happened, because those present already knew, but about deciding how, or even if, it could be controlled. The monarchy, built on discipline and discretion, now found itself confronting something far more unpredictable. A narrative that was already beginning to take shape beyond its reach. At the center of these efforts was the delicate task of managing information. Palace administrative streams, designed to filter and contain internal developments, were activated at full capacity. Messages were refined, timelines reviewed, and access carefully restricted. Insiders whisper that certain channels of communication were quietly tightened, not in panic, but in recognition of the potential consequences. Because once a story begins to move, especially one rooted in implication rather than confirmation, it becomes far more difficult to contain. And this was no ordinary story. It touched on authority, on influence, on the very structure that defines how the monarchy operates behind closed doors. Yet even as these efforts intensified, conflicting reports began to emerge. Different interpretations of the same moment started to circulate within the palace itself, creating a fragmented understanding of what had actually occurred. Some accounts suggested that Prince Edward had simply raised concerns, nothing more. Others implied that his words carried far greater weight, pointing to a deeper challenge that could not be easily dismissed. This divergence, subtle at first, began to widen as more individuals became aware of the situation. And with each new interpretation, the sense of stability that the institution relies upon began to shift. Beyond the palace walls, the first signs of external awareness began to surface. Media insiders, often attuned to even the slightest deviation from routine, started to notice unusual patterns. A delay in scheduled briefings, a change in tone during public remarks. Small details easily overlooked in isolation, but together forming a pattern that hinted at something unfolding behind the scenes. Reports suggest that certain journalists, particularly those with long-standing connections to royal coverage, began to probe more carefully, sensing that the usual rhythm had been disrupted. And once that curiosity is sparked, it rarely fades. Inside the institution, the pressure was beginning to reveal deeper divisions. Insiders whisper that factions, long existing beneath the surface, were now becoming more defined. Some aligned themselves with the need to preserve stability at all costs, emphasizing silence and containment. Others, however, appeared more attuned to the implications of what had been revealed, questioning whether the situation could or should be managed quietly. This growing divide did not manifest in open conflict, but in something far more subtle: hesitation, guarded communication, and a noticeable shift in how decisions were approached. Even public appearances, carefully choreographed as symbols of unity, began to carry faint but unmistakable traces of tension. Observers noted changes so slight they could easily be dismissed as a pause in speech, a measured response, a glance that lingered just a moment too long. Yet within the context of everything unfolding, these details took on new significance. They became part of a larger narrative, one that was no longer confined to whispers and internal discussions, but beginning to shape perception itself. And still, despite every effort to contain it, the situation continued to evolve. Because what had been set in motion was not just a moment, not just an admission, but a shift, one that could not simply be reversed through careful messaging or controlled exposure. The deeper issue, the one at the heart of Edward's words, remained unresolved, quietly pressing against the boundaries of the institution. Yet even as the palace tried to contain it, the deeper issue refused to stay buried. Because this wasn't just about one moment or one admission, it was about the future of the monarchy itself. What had unfolded behind closed doors was no longer confined to personalities or isolated decisions. It had begun to touch something far more enduring: the legacy of an institution shaped over generations, protected through crisis, and defined by an unwavering commitment to continuity. Reports suggest that within palace circles, the conversation quickly shifted from immediate damage control to something deeper, more unsettling. What does this mean for the crown in the years to come? Because when the foundations of authority are quietly tested, the consequences rarely remain limited to the present. At the heart of that legacy stands Queen Elizabeth II, whose influence, though no longer visible, continues to shape the monarchy's internal framework. Those familiar with her reign often describe it as a masterclass in balance between tradition and adaptation, between public duty and private restraint. The systems she upheld were not accidental. They were carefully reinforced structures designed to ensure that no single figure, no matter how influential, could disrupt the delicate equilibrium of the institution. And it is precisely those structures that now appeared, at least according to various interpretations, to be under quiet strain. This is where the weight of the moment truly began to settle. Because if the monarchy is, as it has often been described, a living institution, then its survival depends on its ability to protect the principles that define it. Insiders whisper that concerns were no longer limited to a specific decision or a single shift in influence, but extended to the broader question of safeguarding tradition itself. What happens when established protocols are bent, even subtly? What happens when roles evolve faster than the structures designed to contain them? These were not abstract questions, they were immediate, pressing, and deeply tied to the identity of the crown. Within this evolving narrative, Prince Edward began to be seen in a different light, no longer just the quiet observer or the careful administrator, but also the active participant in the community, the advocate for the cause, and the leader in the field. He was increasingly positioned, at least in the eyes of those watching closely, as a defender of institutional integrity. Reports suggest that his actions, once viewed as cautious or even passive, were now being reinterpreted as deliberate and necessary. He had not simply reacted, he had intervened at a moment when silence might have allowed deeper changes to take root. And in doing so, he had drawn a line, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be ignored. At the same time, Queen Camilla's role began to be viewed through a more critical lens. This was not a sudden shift, but a gradual reassessment shaped by the implications of what had been revealed. Her influence, once seen as a stabilizing force within certain circles, was now being questioned in terms of its reach and its boundaries. Insiders suggest that this was less about personal judgment and more about structural concern about how influence is exercised, where it begins, and where it must ultimately be limited in order to preserve the institution itself. And beneath all of this lay the question of consequence. Not immediate fallout, not the kind that can be addressed through statements or strategic appearances, but long-term impact, the kind that unfolds slowly, shaping perceptions, redefining roles, and altering the trajectory of the monarchy over time. Because once a precedent is set, even quietly, it becomes part of the institution's evolving identity. And reversing such a shift is never simple. As discussions continued behind the scenes, the sense of gravity only deepened. This was no longer about managing a situation. It was about understanding its implications, about ensuring that whatever came next would not compromise the legacy that had been so carefully built. And as those within the palace began to grapple with that reality, one thing became increasingly clear. The true significance of Edward's admission had yet to fully unfold. And as the dust began to settle, one truth became impossible to ignore. Behind the polished image of unity, the monarchy had fractured into something far more complicated and far more fragile. What had once been managed through quiet coordination and unspoken understanding was now, according to insiders, evolving into something more defined, more divided. Reports suggest that within the royal household, subtle alignments were beginning to take shape, not in open opposition, but through shared perspectives, quiet agreements, and a growing awareness that the institution was facing a moment of internal reckoning. These were not factions in the traditional sense. There were no declarations, no formal lines drawn, but the divisions were there, forming beneath the surface, shaping how decisions were interpreted and how actions were weighed. At the center of one emerging alignment stood Prince Edward, whose recent actions had repositioned him in a way few had anticipated. Once seen as a background figure, he was now increasingly viewed as a stabilizing force for those concerned with preserving the monarchy's structural integrity. Insiders whisper that his perspective resonated with others who had long believed in maintaining the established frameworks, particularly those who viewed tradition not as resistance to change, but as a necessary anchor in times of uncertainty. Among those quietly aligned with this viewpoint was Prince William, whose role as heir placed him at a critical intersection between continuity and evolution. Though never publicly stated, various interpretations suggest that William's position reflected a careful balance supporting stability while remaining acutely aware of the institution's future. On the other side of this evolving dynamic was the influence surrounding Queen Camilla. Her support base, while less visible, was no less significant. Reports indicate that her role within the monarchy had, over time, cultivated a network of loyalty and influence that extended beyond formal titles. This was not a matter of power, but of relationships, connections built through years of navigating the complexities of royal life. Those aligned with her perspective, according to insiders, often emphasized adaptability, the need to evolve, and the importance of recognizing the changing nature of the monarchy in a modern context. Yet it was precisely this emphasis on evolution that had begun to raise questions among others, particularly when it appeared to challenge long-standing protocols. As these alignments became more apparent, communication within the palace began to shift. What had once flowed with relative ease now carried an undercurrent of caution. Insiders described conversations that were more measured, decisions that required additional layers of consideration, and an overall atmosphere that felt less certain than before. It was not conflict in the traditional sense, but a quiet tension, one that influenced how information was shared, how strategies were developed, and how trust was maintained. This strain, though subtle, was enough to signal that the institution was navigating more than just a temporary challenge. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, whose response, or rather his restraint, became one of the most closely observed aspects of the unfolding situation. Reports suggest that his silence was not accidental, but strategic, a deliberate choice to avoid escalating tensions while the internal dynamics continued to evolve. Those familiar with his position often describe it as one of careful balance, caught between competing perspectives, each carrying its own weight and consequence. Yet that silence, while measured, also contributed to the sense of uncertainty, leaving others to interpret its meaning in their own way. Through it all, the monarchy continued to present an image of unity to the outside world, maintaining its public duties with the same consistency that has defined it for generations. But beneath that surface, the reality was far more complex. It was an institution quietly navigating internal conflict, weighing its options, and considering how best to move forward without compromising the very principles that sustain it. And as these dynamics continued to unfold, one thing became increasingly clear. The monarchy was being tested, not by external pressure, but from within. But in the end, The monarchy has always survived by adapting and by drawing a line. In the aftermath of shock comes clarity, and for the House of Windsor, that clarity often arrives with consequences. What had once felt uncertain, fluid, even volatile, began to settle into something more defined, more deliberate. Reports suggest that in the days following the internal upheaval, the monarchy did what it has always done in moments of strain. It recalibrated, not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet, decisive adjustments that reshaped the balance of authority without ever openly acknowledging the shift. To the outside world, little appeared different. But within the institution, those who understood its inner workings recognized the signs immediately. Lines had been redrawn, roles had been clarified, and most importantly, boundaries had been reinforced. At the center of this recalibration stood Prince Edward, whose position within the monarchy had subtly but unmistakably transformed. No longer just the quiet observer or the careful administrator, he had emerged as something more defined, as a quiet enforcer of the principles that hold the institution together. Insiders whisper that his actions had not only addressed the immediate concern, but had also reasserted the importance of structure, of process, of the invisible framework that ensures continuity. His influence did not expand in a visible sense. There were no new titles, no public acknowledgements. But within the palace, his role carried a new weight, one rooted in trust, in precision, and in the understanding that when boundaries are tested, someone must be willing to defend them. At the same time, Queen Camilla's position, while unchanged in title, appeared to undergo a quiet recalibration. Reports suggest that this was not a removal of influence, nor a dramatic shift in status, but a refinement, a subtle realignment that placed clearer limits on how that influence could be exercised. Those familiar with the situation describe it as a necessary adjustment, one that allowed the institution to preserve stability without resorting to overt confrontation. It was a delicate balance, maintaining continuity while addressing the concerns that had brought the issue to light in the first place. And in that balance, the monarchy once again demonstrated its preference for evolution over disruption. Beneath these individual shifts, a broader pattern began to emerge. Traditional structures, some of which had been quietly tested, were now being reinforced with renewed clarity. Processes that had once been taken for granted were revisited, reaffirmed, and, where necessary, strengthened. Insiders suggest that this was less about correcting a single issue and more about ensuring that the framework itself remained intact, resilient enough to withstand future challenges. Because the monarchy, at its core, is not defined by moments of crisis, but by how it responds to them, how it absorbs pressure, adapts, and ultimately reasserts its foundations. What makes this moment particularly significant is the priority it reveals. In an age where perception often competes with substance, the institution chose stability over optics, substance over spectacle. There were no public disputes, no visible fractures, no acknowledgement of the tension that had briefly surfaced. Instead, there was a quiet return to form, a reaffirmation of the principle that has guided the monarchy through generations: duty above all else. Not influence, not personal ambition, but duty measured, consistent, and unwavering. And within that renewed emphasis, the deeper message became clear. The events that had unfolded were not just a disruption, but a reminder, a signal that even within the most established institutions, vigilance is required to preserve what matters most. The monarchy had been tested not by external forces, but from within. And in responding to that test, it had once again demonstrated its ability to endure, to adapt, and to protect its legacy without losing sight of its purpose. Because within the monarchy, power is never truly lost, it is simply reassigned, reshaped, and remembered. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.